And of course, Ben, you were the person who wrote the most important speech Cubans have heard in a very long time, one that gave us a lot of hope. And I always say personally that I heard Obama not as a president, but as an activist, talking to us, people to people. And it really created a lot of hope for a lot of people in the island. So now you're a podcaster, which I'm following. I'll tell you the name of the podcast. Follow it. It's really good. It's Pod Save the World. So I just wanted to start. It's going to be a very informal conversation. I just wanted to start by asking you, 10 years later, what are your thoughts about what happened, what could have been done differently, what worked, what didn't work? Like, what are your experiencing things you want to say that you usually don't talk about, but now after so much time has passed, maybe you can talk about?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm glad to be here with people who are care about Cuba. The 10th anniversary, it's interesting, my daughter was born a few days before December 17th. And so I always associate her birthday with that. And she turned 10, and it just was in some respects remarkable that 10 years have gone by. In other respects, it feels like that was 100 years ago. I guess, I will say that there are many things that I was associated with in the US government that I have, I can look back and say, I should have done this differently. And I'll answer the question, things we could have done differently, but I refuse to concede at all that what we were doing broadly was wrong. It was, I think, clearly right. There's almost nothing I was a part of in government that I feel more strongly about as having been the right approach, mainly because it was just creating hope and open space for change and improvements in the lives of people in Cuba. That doesn't mean we did everything right, but the idea that we should open this up and that we should try to facilitate more connectivity between people in Cuba and the rest of the world, that we should try to help improve the humanitarian situation in Cuba, given the horrible needs there, and that, we have a theory of change that instead of just squeezing and lecturing, that if you open up space, that's actually more likely to bring about positive change in Cuba. Like nothing when I look back makes me think that was incorrect. Politics intrudes, and we can talk about how it did. I mean, obviously Trump wins and kind of rolls a bunch of things back, and then one of the bigger regrets is when Biden wins and doesn't take this up. And I have my theories for that. I think there's a word Bob and a word Menendez that I don't think explains it, because it was a 50-50 Senate and he had to confirm other people, and he was the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, whatever, we can talk about that. But to go back to 10 years ago, what I still take kind of some hope from is how much happened in just those 2 years in terms of some tangible progress for people living better lives in Cuba, but the connectivity, the number of people I know who traveled to Cuba who hadn't before, the connections that were forged, the energy that was beginning to be unleashed on the island, that was leading all kinds of different directions. That force felt like the right thing. I mean, I do think that if there's a criticism to be made of what we did, it's that because it was all executive action, which apparently now is all presidents do, but it didn't have the kind of staying power that it might have otherwise had. And so I was pushing at the time, frankly, the last year or two of the Obama administration, to try to legislatively lift the travel ban. That was 80% polling issue that had bipartisan support. It was hard because people like Senator Rubio or Menendez was kind of in legal trouble at that time. So but there were people that were going to make that very difficult. we could have attached something like that though to one of these gigantic spending bills. That's what I was arguing at the time. And so I do think that, to me, the lesson learned, sure, we can talk about whether there are things in implementation we could have done differently, but on a structural level, and if the next time people come back at this, and that will happen inevitably, I do think trying to legislate something, and the travel ban I think would have been the easiest one to do. Not easy is probably not the right word, but the most possible one to do. That's something I would have done differently. And I don't know. I mean, I was trying to move faster, frankly. So I wanted to do as much as I could in the 2 years between December 17th and the end of the Obama administration. I probably also wrongfully thought Hillary Clinton was going to come in and she was going to build on it, and that didn't happen. But even in that context of those 2 years, we were. It was painstaking. The US government works because of the legislative embargo. We had to get offensive legal counsel of the Justice Department to approve anything that happened in Cuba, and we did a lot. But there are areas like really opening up space for that was kind of the next thing in the pipeline. Yeah, I would have liked to have done more to expedite, but yeah, those things have to do with kind of durability of change and prioritization of what you are moving as fast as you can. I'm genuinely not sure, and people don't have to agree with me that the overall concept of what we're doing, I don't know that I would change it.
Well, no surprise. I pretty much completely agree with what Ben has just said, but the main issue, I think, at least at the start 10 years ago, was hope. And I was in Havana the day both presidents went to the airwaves and described what was happening. And you could just feel it all over the city. And one would drive around and you would see Cuban and American flags draped over balconies. And, the joke was, where the hell did they get the American flags, But it was spontaneous. And I could feel it among the local Cubans working at the embassy. I could feel it in the diplomatic corps. You could just feel it on the streets. One of the most interesting things was around this time, 10 years ago, we began negotiating the restoration of diplomatic relations, and thanks to the negotiations that Ben had launched and completed. And two teams would go in, they would read their talking points, and then there was deadly silence, right? Because nobody knew how to communicate with each other. Right. So and I remember this very distinctly. There was a lunch table a bit like this, with all the Americans over here and all the Cubans over here. And there was silence, right? Because nobody just knew how to communicate. And I was reminded of one of my most favorite movies, which is called Moonstruck. And there's a scene at the end of this movie where they're all sitting in the kitchen table and chairs waiting for her fiance to arrive. And the grandfather says, God, somebody tell a joke, right? So I started talking to a Cuban across from me about a comedy show on television, as we all know, called Pamphilo. And he looked at me and he said, you watch Pamphilo? And I said, yeah, of course. And then suddenly conversation started, and I found out that a pretty hardline member of the Cuban delegation was an aficionado of Downton Abbey, right? So I mean, again, you just start sort of learning things about people, and that sort of softens up the situation. I would also say that after a few months, it became very clear of the impact of all of this. I mean, despite, frankly, the Cuban government's best efforts, the flow of information sort of to, from, and within the country was expanding. living conditions, especially those courageous enough to start burgeoning entrepreneurial activities, was improving. Mentalities were changing. The younger Cubans were putting their lives into the island's future rather than plotting to leave. It was an effort to create space for Cubans to figure out their own future somehow. So I think all of this was moving along pretty rapidly. In terms of, and not to repeat some of the things that Ben has mentioned, but I would say in terms of lessons learned, one is, and I put this mostly on myself, we didn't do enough work in South Florida to persuade folks that what was happening was very much to the good and was rather close to their own interests and aspirations. Number one, and on the Cuban side, they certainly didn't do enough to take advantage of the various things that we were trying to push forward in the cultural space and others. There was this sort of massive sense of mistrust of American intentions. And then I would say that the final thing is you could see the tension, you could see the ambivalence of it all on the Cuban side following President Obama's visit, right? The speech, which was spectacular, I would say, to balance and so forth. There were many people, let's say, within the government that were quite taken aback by that and didn't quite know how to deal with it. And so it's unfortunate that there weren't more occasions and opportunities for folks to hear these kinds of thoughts.
Can I, first of all, I want to agree with something and have a slightly different perspective on the South Florida issue. Jeff could not be more correct about, my first meeting about the kind of, we need to just talk to people. My first meeting with the Cubans was in the spring of 2013. And I was meeting with Alejandro Castro, me and Ricardo Viniga, and there were 3 or 4 people on the Cuban side. And the morning was, we met, we talked about how important it was to have this new channel of communication. And then he gave like a 2-hour speech about all the horrible things that the United States has done. And Ricardo had prepared me for this. And I said at the end of it, look, I had the benefit of not being in the State Department, so I didn't have to kind of rebut anything. I was like, look, I'm not here to talk about that. I was like, I know that's important to you, but I could make a speech about all the things that you guys have done that we don't like, but we're here to move forward, et cetera. And then we broke for lunch and it was silent, and it was like standing at a table with some sandwiches and nobody talking. And then I was like, baseball, and I'm a Mets fan, and the best player in the Mets at that time was Cuban, and I said, you guys follow Cespedes, and all of a sudden we started talking about baseball really enthusiastically, and then suddenly Ricardo's talking about fishing off the coast of Cuba, and then when we sat back down, it was a totally different conversation. It's not that there weren't differences, but it's a small point, but it's always whenever people ask me about negotiation or diplomacy, I always tell that story, because it doesn't mean I have to like those people or agree with anything they did. It just means that if you want to get anywhere, you kind of have to figure out a way to talk to people in that fashion. I will say on the South Florida piece, I think you're being too hard on yourself, Jeff. I know you went there, but I went to South Florida, I don't know how many times. I traveled more to Miami than any domestic US destination in my 8 years in the White House. It was never enough, let's just be honest here. And I could have gone 10 more times and I think we'd still be having the same conversation. And President Obama, met with a lot of people, but I think a central tension to identify, if there ever is another window here, is it was very complicated because that speech, for instance, I went to South Florida and I said, I want to meet with as many people as I can for 2 days to have them tell me what to put in that speech. And a lot of that stuff was in the speech. And no surprise, therefore, that the Cuban government hated that speech.
Right.
And the tension I want to identify is, and I totally also agree with Jeff, the Cubans did not take sufficient advantage because they too probably assumed Hillary Clinton was going to win. This is going to drag this out. They should have really worked to build some bridges in South Florida themselves and to open up their economy more speed. But I think that the lesson we had to take is what I kept hearing in South Florida is you're not moving fast enough. You're not pushing hard enough. And the lesson I took from the Cubans I was talking to, who I sincerely believe wanted this to work. Raul Castro didn't have to bet his whole, leadership on this, is you guys are moving way too fast, And that speech kind of encapsulated that because that was way too, I don't regret a word in it. I think so, and it was a speech, a people to people speech. It was an activist talking to people. I don't regret it. But the point is, if you have a Cuba opening on South Florida terms, it will never succeed in Cuba.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a Cuba opening on Cuban government's terms, it's not worth doing and will never get any support in South Florida. And frankly, the lesson is like nobody's gonna get everything they want in Cuba policy, unless what you want is the status quo, which is everything that hardliners in South Florida want. And there has to be some real care given to balancing the very legitimate and deeply felt, and trust me, I heard all the stories of what had happened to people's families and what was happening to people they knew on the island. I'm not diminishing in any way those concerns. The question is, how do you make that effective? And so how do you set expectations and balance the need to not push so hard that you get a door slammed in your face, but push hard enough that you're keeping that door open?
No, I think definitely that speech was like 5-10 years ahead of itself.
Yeah.
But which was great. It showed some sort of way. But I wanted to also address, it is interesting that you said I took them by surprise, all this interest from the United States. And it was true that the Cuban regime looked completely chaotic, completely unprepared, completely erratic, which I think was very evident to absolutely everybody in the world. But I was wondering in terms of hope, because yes, it gave a lot of hope. Cuba changed rapidly. And you could see even like physically people building stuff but I was wondering, what is hope without structural changes? What is hope without real a structure for freedom and for freedom of speech, for voting freely, to have a more than one party? So I wanted to see your and if you try by any chance to push that, what happened? Why you didn't push more?
No, well, look, we absolutely, there was a moment in the initial negotiations where I was like, here's everything that we would like to see. And that included multi-party elections, that included freedom of speech. They were never going to agree to that, and again, they're not going to negotiate away completely their power, as much as I would like there to be multi-party elections in Cuba next week, and so then the question is, how can you find the opening to create, to facilitate structural change when they're not going to negotiate that away? And so, for instance, as a part of the December 17th agreements, it was not publicized because they didn't want to publicize it, obviously. They agreed to expand internet access in Cuba. And I knew that, okay, maybe they can't have elections, but if people started having access to information, well, that's going to be a game changer down there. They were willing to open up space for entrepreneurship. And I knew that the kind of people that might be political activists were probably going to be the people who are entrepreneurs, because they're the people who look for open spaces to build, And so what we were trying to do was, within the confines of, a bilateral negotiation between governments, where it's a strange thing to tell, I guess not strange for some Americans, it's to tell people to change their system of government. To identify those places where economic changes, societal changes, technological changes were most likely to help facilitate political change over time. Not on the timeline I'm sure that you and I would want to see. But that was, that I don't know how else to do it, frankly, other, because they're not going to negotiate away their political system.
Yeah, no, I was, again, I wouldn't be saying anything very different, but it's about creating space for people to figure out their own future down the line. And so all of these changes, information, entrepreneurship, and so forth, it was creating a whole new, I would say, younger generation of Cubans who were thinking about their future in a different way. They were thinking about their country in a different way, and you would see it in various iterations. One economics professor at the University of Havana on the side had a little tourism business, right? But where was most of the income coming from? Well, it was the tourism business, and so again, it's a question of mentality and thinking what might be possible, and that just pervaded, I think, the entire country. And so, honestly, I get them, and this stems from this approach. And so I find myself the most irritated when I hear, well, the Obama approach was a total failure because in 2017, Raul Castro was still in power. Well, I mean, it's just not a realistic comment, and it shows, a level of analysis that's not very deep.
Another thing that I hear a lot, and we and the Cuban community discuss a lot, is, of course, the future of Cuba is in the hand of the Cubans, not the Americans or Europeans or Russians or anybody. But it is true that the American government has a big influence in whatever happens, for good or for bad. So I wanted to bring to you something that happened after your time, which is the idea of the flourishing of the MIPYMEs and all the businesses that are happening now. And if you think that this, because there is a big discussion about, is the economic solution the only one we need, for the change in Cuba, and are we giving too much hope to economics for change? And also understanding that sometimes, not all of them, but sometimes some of the MIPYME, the biggest one, are related with the family of the people who are in government, and they get some permissions other people don't get, and some, so I wonder, what is your position regarding economic solution to arrive to a social and political solution, or if you have any other ideas?
So let me just say quickly, in the first instance, I'm not sure the American government has the level of influence all the time that you think it does. It did, frankly, during our time, I would say. But today, I don't think much, because they hear the same old thing and they just tune it out.
And they know the answer.
Right. Yeah. And they're quite accustomed to this approach for 60 years. In terms of the small and medium enterprises, there are 11,000 of them now. It's 40% of the economy, and so forth. Most of them are not connected to the nomenclatura. I can't give you a specific figure, but I think the impact is pretty significant. And I think the issue is it's kind of what comes with all of that. I can't predict what it is, but it's something different. And again, people begin to think in other ways, and eventually it sort of spreads. So it's not as if, well, we're going to change some of the economic issues and everything else will stay the same. I think we really don't know how it's going to materialize. And I honestly can't think of another way to do it. Let me just also say that I think in this opening, the leadership in Cuba made the calculation that they could control in terms of the economic performance, they could control the pace, they could control it to ensure that they could maintain control. I'm not sure that was the best calculation.
Yeah, I guess I'd just add, we were very focused on the, small private sector. And yes, part of it is Jeff's last point, right? I mean, Penny Pritzker, the Commerce Secretary, got very involved. And ironically, the things that they needed to do to, improve their economy necessitated relinquishing control. Remember all those negotiations around the port,
Right.
And so if you normalize with the relinquishment of control in one space, I do think it begins to change the nature of how the government operates. That's one point. The second point is on the support for small business. There's a Cuban American that Jeff and I spent a lot of time with. I guess I won't name him just in case. But he's very, very powerful, has a lot of resources. And he was late. He came to support the opening after, not supporting it. Because he talked to some Cubans who told him that, here's the thing you have to understand. They were working in this private sector. And it was like, back when the government controlled the entire economy, if they told you to show up at some rally or something, you had to because, your lives were dependent on it. And now he's like, the government calls me to see if I can come down, or somebody, if I can come down to the rally. And I say, fuck you, I'm busy. And I always thought that was part of my language, but that too is about where is control in a society, The last piece is, and so if the government doesn't control everything, there's openings for just something to change. The last piece is that Obama went down to Cuba and he met with a group of dissidents, or we call them that in the US, but basically opposition figures, at a table about this size. Yeah. Jeff, you were there. Yeah. And what was really interesting about Obama is he wasn't as deep inside. If you go into Cuba, you go all the way. He wasn't. He followed it. I briefed him on negotiations and stuff. But so it was interesting to see his reaction to these different perspectives. And to just shorthand it, there were two people. One person, I think, was a barber, and he had started a barbershop and small business. Yeah. And then he was like, I knew everybody on the block. Maybe I can organize this block to improve things on the block, and then maybe to advocate for better healthcare or something. And this all started with a barbershop. There was another guy who was a musician, and he was talking about artists, bringing together artists, and there were no politics, but probably that guy ended up being a part of the movement a couple years later. And then there was another guy who was kind of much more well-known in Florida, and he told Obama that the thing you really need to prioritize is resolving the claims for the Cuban Americans in South Florida. Mm-hmm. And Obama comes up to me after, he's like, that barber was awesome, and he's like, and actually he said in the meeting, that's how political change happens. Yeah. Political change happens when you start, and Obama's a community organizer, when you start organizing around some issue in your neighborhood, and when you create habits in people to come together and to organize for really political purposes. And that's how you build a democracy, whereas he's like, if I wanted to be a politician in Cuba, I don't know why I'd be advocating for, even if they're just, for the claims of people who aren't even here, what was interesting is he, as someone who came in from nowhere, this was obvious to him. Like, the barber is the future, and the artist is the future. And even though they're not running political parties, they are changing politics on the aisle.
I agree with that. The miscalculation is I have to be here because I was in prison to be an artist in Cuba, just to say. Yeah. So I think that was, of course, your solution is not in the hands of Americans, but I did feel, I was a pro-Obama and I got a lot of hate because of that. But I think the implementation had some, of course it was quick, but I think the implementation had some cracks.
What would you say? I'm not
I mean,
Nobody's perfect here, so.
no, of course, and politics is the hardest exercise I have seen in my life.
Remember too, that
But-
we had even started a human rights dialogue with the Cuban government. We had
Which they did not want to have.
which they did not want to have,
Of course, yeah.
but we started it, and we also started a meeting on expropriated properties, and obviously our positions were very different, but we were beginning these processes, and I frankly thought the human rights dialogue could have really blossomed into something important and useful, and obviously that was all stopped when
The meeting was important.
yeah.
It was a protection for everybody in the table as well, you know?
so
Yeah. What do we have done different? I think look at the small letter in the contract. Because Cuban regime has a long experience on tricking people politically. And I felt, I mean, it's normal, it was quick, you had not some, I mean, I'm not saying,
No,
but
I'm
I would
saying
say,
They
That's
didn't
not-
actually agree to, change
Yeah.
their political system. I mean, which, so that's
Yeah.
not the small letter, that's what was in the contract, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, to be honest, I mean, that's, they promised to release people. And they released them, and then they did I guess the small letter would have been not the rearrest of but that
A few,
would
yeah.
only apply to 53.
nevertheless, it's still an iconic moment, it's still a historical moment, people still remember that as something could happen here differently, so I think that was, after so many years of not having hope, that was really a big change. Before I open up, I just want to bring this to today. Cuba today. What are your thoughts? I mean, beyond the Trump measures and stuff, but what are your thoughts after seeing July 11 protest, after seeing all the development in Cuban civic society, like groups being more unified, more prepared, more demanding, people going to the street, moms putting the fridge on the middle of the street, open to show there is no food. So what are your feelings now? Not so much in terms of the American politics, which we know what it is, and it's the same one. But what will you tell the people in Cuba?
Well, look, it's just been very difficult to watch the last 8 years because I just still believe, I'll get to the Cuban side, that the thing that would have been more helpful to that movement would have been more connectivity to the rest of the world. And so and something like that happens, and then the instinct is now we have to punish them more, which is a human instinct, but it's not. I genuinely don't think that's what's most helpful.
He's punishing everybody, so we are not.
Yeah, well, that's true. But I'd say that look, I think Cubans are absolutely fed up, and they the humanitarian situation is what pains me the most. Malnutrition, just lack of hope, and clearly though there's still a resilience that shows up in protests like that, or just in kind of people's lives. And I honestly, I guess there are two ways to think about this. In a world in which the Cuban government is going to remain in control of Cuba, what you really need is for those people to have as much solidarity with people outside of Cuba as possible. And so one thing I'd like to see, be separate from policy changes, is a broadening of the communities that have that solidarity with Cubans. It's been a pretty we all know, there's Cuban Americans, and then there's people who just have particular love of Cuba, and then there are people that have some connection, who've been involved. We had some people from agricultural states, but beyond that, I just think artists, social movements need to care more and connect more with Cubans, so that there's kind of a broader collective that is pushing for change on the island, or pushing for change in US policies. Then the other, look, maybe the Cuban government does collapse at some point. I mean, I wouldn't bet on that because they've been through so much, but what I would advise Cubans is the barbershop point, which is, think about, because one of the things I've seen is, political change when it usually comes very quickly. And you need to be ready, for that moment. And so I would be thinking about not just the protest piece, but also the kind of, the sense of having an idea of what you would like your community to be like, or how you might organize if you had real space to do so that you're ready in case there is some rapid change. Because what I worry about is even if there is some kind of collapse, the people who usually emerge from that are actually the worst people. It's like the most heavily armed people. It's like the military, the political regime may unravel a bit, but then all of a sudden you have a military dictatorship that's even worse, and that's, and so I think you just have to do that thinking as well as doing the oppositional.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is you had an earlier question about influence of the U.S. and the U.S. Government, but mostly the U.S. and the American people in general. And I think I would say that had we continued the policy that we had we continued the engagement, and not just the American government, but the hundreds of thousands of Americans that were coming and going, and all the various cultural and other kinds of connections that were being made, what happened in July of 2021 might have happened in a very different way.
You're right about being ready, because even the opposition was not ready for the July 11th. And that was the biggest lesson. Everybody was out in the street and nobody knew what to do.
Yeah.
And
that's very common. I've seen that happen all over the world. But that's an important.
Well, I invite you guys if you have any questions.
Yeah, thank you to both. And I wanted to pick up on one of Tanya's questions about structural change, the need to that as well. But on the other side, since we have this peek into the behind the scenes of regime change, politics, could you tell us, this is a question from Mr. Rhodes, could you tell us more about how much the horizon of lifting the embargo was there in that moment? And then I have like quick personal question. You said you regret nothing of what you said, and I would repeat Tanya's question as well, like what would you have done differently?
Well, I didn't say nothing. I said, I actually would have tried to structurally change things with the travel ban. I think there are things we could have prioritized, like the philanthropic activity that could address humanitarian needs. So it's not nothing. When I say I don't regret the overall approach. I'm sure there are plenty of things, small, like pieces of what because we're doing so many things,
Is there a specific something?
Well, I say, the getting philanthropies in. We were trying to do stuff with the church that maybe, there was an openness in the island to more free speech in church spaces and church broadcasting that I presumably we could have pushed harder on.
Commercial activity as well.
Commercial activity as well too.
A lot of a number of very large American corporations who had come down were interested in doing things that would have fit within the regulatory changes that were made, and had those arrangements materialized. I think it would have been a lot harder to make the radical changes that the first Trump administration did. But on that side, in that case, the Cubans were extremely reluctant to make those sort of final agreements, if you will. I don't know, this fear of becoming dependent upon the American economy, whatever it was. I think that was another area. Sorry.
Well, to be fair, we had problems too because our sanctions, and this leads into your embargo question. Part of the reason you couldn't get those deals done is for we had to painstakingly negotiate for one bank to finance any transactions. In Cuba,
That's right.
So US sanctions made it hard to do what we were trying to do. We were trying to avoid breaking our own laws in doing anything down there, you know.
That's true.
And everybody had to get a license. And so look, I supported lifting the embargo because I just think you open things up and you allow activity, it's going to bring about more positive change on a faster basis. I just subscribe to that view. If you look back, shockingly, the 2016 Democratic Party platform had lifting the embargo in it, which it ceased to have in 2020. And so that's the direction we were moving. There were not the votes to lift the embargo in Congress in 2016. There were, it was close though. And if you started to get companies down there, then most of the votes that did exist were because the airlines were calling senators and saying, we want to fly to Cuba, you know? So if you want to lift the embargo, you have to create stakeholders for members of Congress to take those votes. And that's where the economy, you know, and the economic opening does create stakeholders. And again, I believe that would create structural change. That if things are opened up, people are traveling, American businesses are down there. You know, Senator Rubio and I had this debate privately multiple times where he'd say, well, look how that worked in Vietnam, you know. And I would say, well, Vietnam is a country of over 80 million people, you know, several thousand miles away from the United States. I actually think this is different, you know. I mean, this is 90 miles from the United States. It's a small country. And that level of engagement from the United States, like you said, just imagine if we continued what we were doing and say even lifted the embargo, and you've got tons of Americans in Cuba at all times. You got internet access, you've got international media there, you've got some US businesses there, and then July 11th happens. It would have been much, much more difficult for them to just arrest everybody.
Correct.
And so I know people find it dissatisfying that we can't extract the political change in the negotiation. But I think that's missing the way in which it creates an environment in which political change is much more likely.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I wanted to ask about the role of China, because like I feel like China like props up the Cuban regime and gives them a lot of resources and does a spy base there, right? So what's the role of the US government getting China on board, like, you know, just like the North Korea stuff, like, you know, to open up and to have like, you know, more open spaces?
Let me relay a conversation I had with the Chinese ambassador in Havana. Granted, it was 10 years ago. The question I asked him was, where are you? Why aren't you here? I don't see very many of your compatriots here. I don't see very many business activity. I don't see much of anything. And the response was, and fortunately for him, he's now retired. He said to me, you can't make any money here. This is like China in 1983, 1984. It's going to be a while before we're really going to engage. So I think the whole notion of you know, Chinese presence in Cuba is a little bit exaggerated.
Yeah, in my experience, the Russians were more aggressive, because they didn't look at it through the prism of money. They looked at it purely through the prism of strategic interests.
Right.
And talking to people recently, I think now they see it as a place where some of the sanctioned oligarch money can be parked, and so I actually think that I agree. I never saw anything that convinced me that they may have some listening post or something, but I never felt like a huge amount of Chinese.
We have several. I want to go into the internet question because I have several ones. I'm going to try to summarize and make a group of them. So there's some about Cuba, and at the time there's some about now. So there is somebody asking How do you address the often hard criticism that the US made all the concessions and Cuba was made none? Another person saying, I want to leave that for later, but sorry. Sorry. No, I will say it.
No, I'm
Freedom
kidding.
of expression, but and then another person is saying, like, what do you think about the Trump administration inclusion of Orbit SA on the Cuban restricted list? How can the United States facilitate legal remittances flows without providing an economic benefit for the Cuban government?
So I'll take the first question, which I've heard, you know.
1 second, and one very follow. Was a meeting between Obama and Fidel ever considered?
No, that one I can deal with quickly because neither of them, you know, I mean, it was not in either of their interests to have that meeting. So neither Obama nor I ever met Fidel. On the first question, I get why people ask it, but I almost don't understand it because I could say, you know, we got some important things in terms of like being released and internet access and a few other things like that. But the bigger point here is that the concession was them agreeing to allow us to open an embassy. It's a massive concession that they did not want to do at the beginning of negotiations because they for the conversation we had been having, like were more aware than us that the minute there's an embassy, the minute the U.S. is resumed to do things, they're more vulnerable. And I think Raul Castro made this calculation ultimately that he would rather initiate some process of change than leave it to other people, probably because he knew, look what's happening now that the other people are there. You know, it's possible, and I believe people can disagree that Raul is not Fidel. Doesn't mean he's a Democrat. It just means he's a little more pragmatic. Mm-hmm. And so to me, the concession was that we still have an embargo in place on your country, and we're opening embassies and we're making agreements, and so I get why people may not agree with that, but you have to psychologically get in their heads. It's not your version of what a concession is. It's they're the ones making the concession. And I can tell you that was a very difficult thing to negotiate to get there. And the other thing I'd say is, I don't know what we conceded. When people say this, we made all the concessions. Like we conceded to allow Americans to travel to Cuba. like I just don't see it as a concession. I didn't think our sanctions were working. So I don't know why it's a concession to end certain things that aren't working. And then, like I said, I would have looked at the embargo, not as a concession, as a smarter policy, you know. So I actually never felt like beyond, okay, you could say you legitimize, Obama that met with Raul. That's fair. That's a concession of sorts. But the sanction, the kind of travel and licensing changes that we did because we thought that was a better Cuba policy. You know, people can disagree, but we didn't think of them at all as concessions. And in fact, they weren't a part of the agreement itself. They were things that we just chose to do.
It's also kind of playing the short game versus playing the long game, I think.
In the process, you answered another question, so that was great.
On Orbit, I think what's going to happen now is that the remittances are going to be pushed into the gray or illegal zone. It's not as if they're going to stop. So I don't think it makes a great deal of sense. There needs to be an entity through which these kinds of remittances can be made. I think those in the United States who want to make these remittances will demand it. I get the point of the question about the power of Gaesa and so forth. But then we get into kind of the consistency question. If there's a country that is completely dominated by the military, it's Egypt. And no one ever says a bloody word about concern about that, or in Turkey, or in Saudi Arabia, or wherever it might be. So and I think we just need to find another entity. Perhaps the Cubans will create one that isn't connected to Gaisa. Maybe Orbit isn't connected to Gaisa. I don't really know myself, but again, the result is everything just moves into the gray zone, which is not helpful to anyone.
Well, these are the questions I was postponing. Okay, Ben. Can use of Guantanamo as a camp to concentrate expel migrants be challenged? That's why I expect as a violation of the 1903 treaty, which is specified for use as calling or naval station only and not for other purposes. In any case, wasn't it internationally illegitimate unequal treaty that Cuba was forced to accept in order to obtain the removal of US troops and independence?
You can challenge it, but Trump will ignore that. I mean, it's a short answer. I mean, I because it's a military facility, this is probably why he's drawn to it and why George Bush was drawn to it for the prison he constructed. The US has the US president has tremendous leeway to do whatever they want at that facility. I mean, you know, obviously they broke laws in the treatment of people down there, and they lost court cases on that. But just in terms of the idea of can we put people here, I think he's going to ignore legal challenges and actually they might not succeed because of the flexibility the US military has. I will say. And this is a lesson learned too. I mean, I was kind of joking with you last night that the Cubans made a proposal to me to take Guantanamo and keep all the people in prison, which is a clever proposal. But actually, my experience in the negotiation generally is that the bigger it got, the easier it was to. I don't think the United States needs a naval base in Guantanamo Bay. I agree that the treaty's insane. It's like we send what, $1,000?
I think it's 4,000.
That they then Fidel used to theatrically tear it up, and but make that part of the negotiations, and maybe that you use to try to extract bigger concessions around politics, right? Because actually that's a huge thing for them to do, but that one you might need to require serious political change, and so. It may be that actually if introducing Guantanamo, I heard all these things about how essential Guantanamo was for what? This is not like in the Middle East, I'm not persuaded that, I mean, I know that we've probably built a lot of logistics chains into Latin America through Guantanamo, but if you could actually get political change in Cuba, that would be worth it.
The other question was, can you think of any positive advantages in having someone like Marco Rubio as Secretary of State to improve the conditions for the Cuban people?
Why don't you take that one, Jeff?
Look, on the positive side of the ledger, you have someone who knows the region well, who speaks Spanish. So presumably, that's not a bad thing. On the Cuba side, I think we just have to look at the two statements he's recently made. There was one on January 30th, on the eve of his trip to Panama, Costa Rica, Guatemala, and the Dominican Republic, where he laid out some of the priorities of the new administration, migration, control of borders, supply chains, all these kinds of things.
USA.
He didn't talk about USA in that statement, and it was all about all the things we need to do to put America first. And he said we're not going to focus on, what does he call them, ideological utopia or utopian ideologies. I think that was the phrase. In that statement, there was nothing about shared democratic values or human rights or anything like that. The next day, there was a statement on Cuba. We're going to toughen US policy toward Cuba. I mean, it's tough enough even under the Biden administration. And that statement was all about accountability and human rights, all very, very critical right? With respect to Cuba, but to me, there's a significant inconsistency there. And so I assume that we're going to see an approach toward Cuba, to Nicaragua and Venezuela too, is just squeeze and squeeze and squeeze and hope for, I don't know, implosion, whatever. And having a failed state 90 miles from our border, I'm not sure is such a great idea.
And just to put a point on this, he also on his first trip went to El Salvador. And
Oh, yes, right.
Bukele offered to take, prisoners from the United States or other countries
Right.
if we would basically subsidize his prison system.
for price.
And this is, this is basically, and Rubio said this was one of the greatest gestures of friendship that any leader has ever made. Literally said that.
Yes.
And it's like, that makes your rhetoric about Cuba, and this would be my challenge to people who support this approach. Like, how do you not see that is counterproductive? like all your messaging on Cuba, as Jeff says, is about human rights and democracy.
Mhm.
And then you're literally paying for a prison system in El Salvador where people are being detained without charge, and there are going to be mass trials of including innocent people.
I'm not sure Venezuelans are so excited anymore, though.
Well, true, and of course.
They're not sure how to feel, from my experience.
And I think if I read things right, there are 110,000 Cubans. Their status is sort of in the United States, and their status is a little bit in doubt as well.
Yeah, somebody asked about that, about what do you guys expect on Cuban people with the I-228 parole or CBP one or any of those processing?
Well, I think those are the ones that are now in question, and as I understood, there are something like 110,000 Cubans who now in the United States who fall into that category, and I would worry for them because I'm not sure what their status is going to be. So we'll have to see, and I'm guessing that certain legislators in South Florida are also a bit surprised with the direction that this is going, and I'll be quite curious to see what their reactions are too.
And bear in mind, Trump never has to run for re-election. Right. So if a bunch of people,
Really? They were thinking about third term.
I don't. And I don't think he does either. He jokes about it. But it's important because there's no leverage for these, people in Florida. Like, well, we delivered Florida for Trump 3 times. He doesn't care, And the immigration enforcement people at ICE don't see Cubans as in a different category from other people. They really don't. I've interacted with them. And so Rubio, who might care, is not in charge of that. And so I think it is a very real risk.
I want to open again to people here.
I'm not a Cuban specialist, but I just came back from Cuba after staying for 3 weeks. I went there for vacation, but I got so interested by the country and the people. So I met with 7 professors and through translator talked to the people. I posed a question to the professors. Well, one is, what's your relationship with the government? 2 professors, I'm an economist. I'm a retired professor of economics at Harvard. And I said, do you actually interact with the government officials about the economy, about the changes, about the privatization, development of small business and so forth? Well, that's not my main point. I discovered they do exchange, but they say they don't necessarily listen to them.
Yeah.
But then I posed this question to the 7 professors at lunch. I say, if I'm the political leader of Cuba today, I would change the bilateral game to a trilateral one. I will try to align with another powerful nation or 2. Why should I always be a satellite to the United States? You mentioned about China. I work in China. I go there 4 times a year. I think you can persuade China to actually take interest in Cuba now. Playing a different card. Let me give you the reaction of the 7 professors. They were all stunned. They said, how, we cannot think that way. My question to you is, why doesn't Cuba try to change how the game is played? Is there any benefit to Cuba that can come from it?
I would say that, look, there even things that the Cuban government in my conversations, right, was very embittered over the 1990s where they feel like Russia abandoned them.
Yes.
And so even though it may seem like it's in their obvious strategic and economic interest to, maybe have China take a much greater role and become a kind of big brother, I actually do think that despite the fact that it's 2 communist parties and that there is actually some resistance to, any dependency. Their sovereignty gene is directed at the United States, but particularly after they felt like Russia cut them loose, there's a bit of reticence. But I think you're not wrong. I think you're right. I would like to see them take a different approach, even in like Latin America, because their approach for a long time has basically been they're kind of the vanguard of the kind of leftist politics in Latin America. And insofar as they have solidarity with Latin America, it's mainly with, like-minded leftist leaders, either very odious ones like Maduro, or, they can get along with Lula. And actually, I think if they removed a little bit of ideology, because I've never, I'm sure Milei doesn't agree. Most Latin American leaders, even on the center right, like the biggest proponent of the Cuba opening in our administration was Santos, the president of Colombia, who really helped persuade President Obama to do this. And he was, I guess, a centrist. He wasn't a leftist, that's for sure.
No.
And I think that if there was an effort, instead of it being China, although that's one option for them, to try to get a bunch of, Brazil, Mexico, strengthened numbers, Brazil, Mexico, Chile, Colombia, to be much more politically, and economically. I mean, the U.S. sanctions make it very hard for anybody to do any economic business, but I do think kind of getting past the paradigm of kind of 1960s politics to I think it'd be in their own self-interest to try to change the nature of their interactions with governments in the hemisphere to be more about trying to improve things in Cuba than being just about fighting about ideology.
Yeah, and just to reinforce that point, I recall many times hearing from Cuban interlocutors that they were determined, and again, this was 10 years ago, but first it was Spain, then it was the US, then it was the Soviet Union, then it was Venezuela, and this time they were going to make sure that they had a full cast of economic and political partners. They did not want to fall back into that situation where they were dependent upon one country. And I imagine the Russian reaction to the fall of Assad in Syria did not go unnoticed, right? Where the Russians did absolutely nothing for their key ally.
And one just, because you'll find this interesting. I learned at some point in the process of negotiating with them that they were being kind of coached by the Vietnamese about how to pursue normalization. But also, not just about that, the Vietnamese, if you look at their export pie chart, it's like remarkably designed to not be overly dependent on China or the United States or Japan or anybody else. And the Cubans were trying to replicate the Vietnamese diversification strategy, which is easier for Vietnam because they've liberalized their economy. But I thought that was interesting.
Maybe one last question.
Hi, thanks. This is all really interesting. And I mean, maybe partly on that note about relationships to other Latin American countries, I'm wondering if you could comment on the, Cuba's medical internationalism, the doctors in a sense, I mean, around the world, but Latin America specifically, right? Obama, if I understand correctly, undid the medical parole program of trying to recruit the doctors. Trump reinstated it. I'm just curious about either that under Obama or as it stands right now, because that was something the Trump administration did in its first term. You know,
I'd say, I mean, first of all, this gets to the point Jeff made about like Saudi Arabia, and there's no country in the world that the US does anything like that with. You know, we're going to recruit, you know, and yes, we know doctors are sent abroad for political purposes. I'm sure the security apparatus is represented among those doctors.
Yeah, of course.
But it felt like such a vestige of a Cold War mentality, because, you know, it was just such an extreme sanction that felt it felt like it undermined the credibility of the United States that we did that, you know, because actually in those countries they welcome those doctors, and so the United States isn't coming in to a third country and saying you can't have these doctors or we're going to try to recruit them. That's actually was creating friction in other countries in Latin America. And you know, we actually recruited Cuban doctors to go to West Africa to fight Ebola.
Mhm.
I mean, so we kind of fully shifted our posture on this. And again, I know there are different sides to this argument, but does your policy appear to be about trying, you know, as someone who doesn't favor sanctions for policies in general, even if you do embrace a certain amount of sanctions, presumably you're doing it again to help incentivize, push, pressure for political changes. There are certain sanctions on Cuba that just felt punitive to me. Like they didn't feel like they were achieving any political objective. They just felt like, what's the harshest sanction we can draw in a room in Washington? And the medical pearl one felt that way to me.
I would say that one of the most let's say dramatic moments in this attempted normalization between the US and Cuba came in October of 2016 when the United States decided to change its vote on the annual embargo vote at the UN from no to abstention. And then US Ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, made this very powerful speech where she talked about what it took to take a Cuban doctor who was in Sierra Leone or one of the West African countries who came down with Ebola. And then she went through, it was an American group of doctors who got him to X, and then a Canadian plane that took him to Y, and then a Swiss medical team that took him here, and kind of describing that's how the international community should work. And that's what I feel when I hear this. Of course, there are different views on this particular issue, but it feels on those who very much oppose it that it's described in very exaggerated fashion.
I just want to thank both of you, Ambassador DeLaurentis and Ben, for the candid answers, for being so open to the questions, and also to make us travel back to a time of hope.
Well, look, I want to thank you. We risk much less. The hopeful point is just keep getting better so that at some point things can improve.
Yeah, I was so hopeful
Yeah.
that I put a microphone in Revolution Square,
Yeah.
because I'm like,
I remember.
great,
Yes.
democracy is coming.
remember.
So, That's another story.
That's right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming here. Thank you to Dr. Klaas for the amazing projects you do in Warburg Center.
Thank you very much.
The best part, the Cuban government